been busy for me looking at a very exciting European election calendar for 2017. And I just want to read you, before I introduce our two speakers, I want to read to you a headline from Bloomberg on February the 24th. Germany, France send top diplomats to Washington looking for answers. So let me introduce our top diplomats.
So we
here.
share our questions with you.
Yes, we are going to get to that. We want the questions and the answers. But let me first begin by welcoming Nicolas de Rivière, who is the Director General for Political Affairs and Security at the French Foreign Ministry. Since 2014, Nicolas has been a wonderful colleague and frequent visitor to Washington and has held such a distinguished career prior to becoming Director General. Nicolas served as Assistant Secretary for United Nations, international organizations, human rights, and francophonie. He has spent an enormous amount of time at the UN as Deputy Permanent Representative and as political counselor in the French mission. And also, in your very early years, spent some time in Washington. So, yeah. Nicolas, we're delighted to have you with us. And then to my right, we have Andreas Michaelis, Political Director of the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin, another incredibly seasoned German diplomat who, prior to becoming political director, was German ambassador to Israel. I'm sure a fascinating assignment. And prior to that was the Director General for the Near East Affairs Bureau in North Africa. And prior to that, he was the Director General for Asia and Pacific Affairs, so spanning the world, and was former German ambassador to Singapore. So we have incredible breadth, depth of knowledge here on global affairs. And gentlemen, we have a lot to talk about, so we are dispensing a bit the formalities and want to dig into the conversation. But Nicolas, let me turn to you, because it's not usual for a French diplomat and a German diplomat, top diplomats, to come together to talk to your US counterparts. Nicolas, tell us about that.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Heather. I think it's good to be here today. And thank you, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I'm especially happy to be here together with Andreas, who is my colleague, but also a friend. We spend our weeks together in Europe and all over the world trying to do our job in close coordination. And you're right, I think it's probably the first time that we do this kind of visit together. We wanted to come together to see the new administration in a Franco-German format, because we, in Germany, I think we have a lot in common. We do not agree always on 100% of the issues, but we agree on the essential issues. And this is what we wanted to discuss with our colleagues at the State Department, at the NSC, in Congress, and with you as well. Regarding today's discussion, I think it's more a Q&A, and I will be very open and candid with you. I just wanted to signal three things. First, it's about the transatlantic relationship. It's very important for us. There are debates everywhere in this country, in Europe, about NATO, about the European Union, about the value of this partnership. For us in France, and even if we have the same debates, the discussion remains extremely important, but this partnership, this relation remains as relevant as after World War II. After World War II, we created NATO, we had the Marshall Plan, we created the European Union, we had this cooperation. Now we are facing different challenges, and in today's world, whether it's global security, crisis, prosperity, trade, I believe that the United States and Europe as a whole have a lot in common and are stronger together. So this is message number one. I think we need to revitalize the transatlantic relation, but it remains extremely relevant and useful for all of us. Regarding the European Union, and Heather, you mentioned the discussion of the future of the European Union, and we may go into the detail. Let's look at the past. We will celebrate next month in Italy the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome, the beginning of the European Union. Europe has been in a kind of crisis of the last 10 years because of the financial crisis, because of Greece, because of migration, because of security, etc., etc. And it's true that we have things to do to improve the system, to make it work better. I forgot to mention Brexit 6 months ago, which is part of the crisis, obviously. Now, if you look the evolution between 1957 and now, a lot have been achieved. It's first of all about peace in Europe. All the time. My grandfather was in World War I against Germans, and my grandfather was in World War II. My father was a friend of Germany, and now we have peace in Europe. It's invaluable, and if I look at the future, this is what we have to do in the future, continue to consolidate the peace in Europe and project peace around. And the same for trade and prosperity. The growth in Europe has been very important. We have a single currency. It has its weaknesses, but the people in Europe criticize it. But it's very important to not to lose these assets. And last remark on the Franco-German relation. I started with that and I finished with that. For us, it's very important. We are different, but we are together. This relation, I think, in a way, it's an example for other parts of the world because we prioritize the compromise and projects instead of emphasizing the differences and the conflicts, which we may have as well. So I think it's a good example of what we should do in the world, I hope. And second, if you look at Europe, I think everybody's referring to the notion of an engine. And in a way, it's true. It doesn't mean that the rest of Europe is irrelevant, not at all, but France and Germany, we are 150 million people, so it's larger than Russia. Meaning we are 1/3 of the European Union. In terms of GDP, it's even more. I think we are 40% of European Union GDP. I don't know how many times stronger than Russia in terms of GDP, meaning that politically, when France and Germany agree on an initiative, on a project, on a reform, we believe we can make the difference. And the year to come, 2017, will be critical because we have elections in France, we have elections in Germany, there are threats and crises, etc. But all in all, we need to keep the engine, to make the engine work well, and make sure that in the future we use that for the common good of Europe and the transatlantic relation.
Thank you so much. Andreas, let me turn to you. As you were preparing for this trip, what were some of the key priorities you wanted to accomplish? What did Berlin need to accomplish from this visit? And then how do you two come at this new administration, which has obviously said some very controversial things about Europe, about the transatlantic relationship, even very specifically about Germany and the euro and the use of the euro. Help us put this into some context.
Thank you very much. I would like to underscore how important the future of Europe is for us. And if I say for us, that includes France, of course, for obvious reasons. It is existential for us, the future of the European Union. I understand from previous meetings here in Washington that sometimes, and I have sympathy for that, it is difficult to understand the mechanics of the European Union. It's complicated, and it's difficult for people who haven't served in Brussels, who haven't served as a member or a representative of a member state to really understand how that machine works. So there have always been questions from the US side. I would like to explain, we would like to explain how important that union is for us. It should not be mistaken for a nation state. So our capabilities are not the capabilities of a nation state, and some of the driving forces are not the driving forces of internal politics of a nation state. So a lot of explaining is required to underscore that point, that it is existential for us. But even if, at the end of the day, the US side is not able is trying but not able to fully understand what this means for us, I think on the basis of our transatlantic experience, they should accept the fact and factor it in its own policies vis-à-vis Europe. Just to understand that if a close partner tells you that the future of that union is crucially important in terms of security, in terms of economic well-being, in terms of stability, I think that is something that is almost sufficiently explained if you don't want to go into the details. So Europe, I think, is a very important point. We just come from a meeting where we have concentrated on trade issues. Trade is crucially important as well. I would probably say that after the reassuring signals we have received in Munich with regard to security policy and the importance of NATO for this administration, that is probably the issue that comes first when we ask the question, with what policy are we going to deal in the next month? There also, I think, we have every reason to make ourselves heard, to explain what kind of trade system we advocate, and to look into some of the early signals which we have received from the US with regard to, I put it very diplomatically, new nuances with regard to trade and economic policies. And then I would say we already opened the door to a wide range of foreign policy issues, ranging from Ukraine to Iran. We have been part of the group that has negotiated the JCPOA. Nicolas, in particular, has been one of the brave men who sat through all the negotiations and came out with an agreement successfully towards the end. We think this is a good agreement, and it needs to be upheld. It needs to be protected. And then Ukraine, I think that's a very obvious case for Franco-German cooperation, because within the Normandy format, it is France and Germany that are dealing with the Russian Federation and Ukraine when it comes to the Minsk Agreement and its implementation. And it is only a very short step from all questions pertaining to stability in eastern Ukraine to the question of how you do policy with Russia. And it is, I think, clearly seen that the way this US administration is dealing with Russia is crucial when it comes to foreign policy. I think we have some valuable experience in dealing with the Russian Federation. So there, I think we have to share these experiences and coordinate our approaches. Many other regional conflicts could be mentioned. The last, and I want to end with this, the last country that is particularly important in terms of foreign policy and trade policies is, of course, China. And the same, I think, holds true what I've said about Russia. We have quite valuable, I think, stock of experiences in China policy and China trade. And I could sense today, especially when it comes to the question of looking at trade balances and imbalances, that it is useful to intensify this kind of dialogue, which we had already intensified under the previous administration. We suddenly found that France, Germany, the US, Europe and the US need to compare notes when it comes to their China policies.
Thank you so much. I have to say that the challenge of preparing for this conversation, my list was so long, and sort of how do you organize this conversation? So how I think we're going to do it is we're going to start a little bit within Europe, and then with your permission, I'd like to branch out. And Andreas, you hit all of the issues that I think are so important to explore. So speaking of the future of Europe as existential, we had today the release by European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, the white paper, The Future of Europe, which is the document that looks at what the EU at 27 should look like. Let me ask you both, the question of how profound Brexit is changing how Europe, how the EU is thinking about itself. How has it changed the foreign policy conversations? The UK is a major driver of foreign and security policy. How does this change, and how are you looking at these negotiations? This is beyond your portfolios. Others are going to be leading this negotiation at the EU level. But how does this impact your work? I'm thinking, Nicola, at the Security Council, where Britain and France do a lot of coordination, thinking about on Russia policy. Andreas, help us understand this, put it in some context.
Yes, we are just at the beginning. The British people made the decision in June. We have to respect this decision. It's Brexit. The Prime Minister of Britain explained our view a couple of weeks ago, the approach he would conduct, and we have to respect the approach and start the negotiation with the UK. We are still waiting for the UK to trigger the so-called Article 50 of the treaty, probably in a month from now, and then the negotiation will start between the UK and the European Union for the next 2 years to organize, if I may say so, the divorce, the modalities of the divorce, and design the relation between the UK and the European Union after the divorce. So this is where we are. We are just at the beginning, and we'll see where we go. I can tell you we just want a win-win solution. I think nobody wants a lose-lose solution, and it's very important. This being said, referring to the Juncker paper and the proposal, it's logical in this context that the rest of the group is thinking together, the 27, on the way ahead. So this is why we had these meetings in Bratislava, and this is why we will continue to look at our future. Obviously, for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, financial crisis, migration, security, Brexit, etc., they are not just fixes to put on the European project, but reforms to implement, to make it work better for the citizens, and also the economy, jobs, or reforming our welfare state, which has probably to be done in a way. So this is all part of the discussion in Europe. This is why Juncker and all the European leaders are trying to work together to preserve the project. The conversation will continue. What is critical for us, and probably I think Germany as well, is to protect the European Union project. And this is why we need to protect the integrity of the project, not enter a negotiation and a game where at the end of the process we would go for a kind of dissolution of the European project, a kind of à la carte, etc. So we need to make sure that this negotiation with the UK will not set a bad precedent going for a dissolution of the projects. The one I mentioned earlier, peace, stability in Europe, which is key, and also an internal market, growth, currency for most of us, etc. So we need to reform to protect that. I think this is what our people want. They want also more security, because it's needed, more efficient policy against migration, and this is what we have to do, and the German Chancellor took the initiatives on that. So we will continue on that in an open manner. Now, regarding foreign policy and security policy, it's no need to say that the UK is a key partner for us, for Europe, I think for France. We even have a bilateral treaty with the UK. We need to keep this relation with the UK. We will keep a relation with the UK during Brexit, after Brexit, because we need to cooperate. We have a lot in common. We need to interact together to resolve the crisis. For France, which is a specificity, we are a nuclear power and permanent member like the UK, so we have issues in common, we have projects in common. Now, it will be different for them. They will be outside the European Union, and in a way we will have to tailor some modalities of interaction between the European Union as an entity and the UK, to make sure that we interact. It's obvious that when they go out of the Union, they cannot be part from inside, from the decision-making process, it will be different. But we will certainly look in a solution that will preserve a good degree of cooperation with the UK in the Security Council on nuclear issues, and including also on European interests abroad and in our neighborhood. So I think it's clear.
And certainly, Chancellor Merkel has taken a pragmatic approach as these begin the framework of looking at the divorce, as Nicolas says. What is your approach from the Foreign Office?
I think, in all earnest, we're only going to start this process after the German elections in September. The question of how we respond with regard to the constitution of the European Union, and constitution now in a neutral, not in a legal sense. I think you have to step back a little bit in time to understand where we find ourselves now. We had a very intense debate in Europe towards the late 90s, early 2000s about a constitution for Europe, because we very much felt that the way we had constructed that entity, par la méthode Monnet, simply by adding another treaty after another treaty, had come to an end, that we somehow had to define the finality of that project. That's why we started to work on a constitution for Europe. We had to take a detour because suddenly two referenda came up. Referenda are always difficult, like the one on the Brexit we've just seen. In this case, we had a referendum in France, a referendum in the Netherlands, and we could not further, I cut it very short, we could not further pursue the project. However, Europe was able to overcome that backlash by concentrating on developing a new treaty, and that new treaty, which falls short of the constitution, is the Treaty of Lisbon, which is now the foundation on which we work. Now, the Treaty of Lisbon was the answer to an incredibly enlarged union. Suddenly, we had the Eastern neighbors that became part of our common house, and it has helped to work on the basis of the treaties which were in existence before. However, we did not succeed in addressing all issues through the Lisbon Treaty. So even without the Brexit at some point in time, I think it would have been necessary to take a fresh look at the deficiencies of the European Union. Sure. And clearly there are deficiencies. I'm far from following our British friends and saying that the deficiencies justify a Brexit. On the contrary, they justify an energetic approach towards overcoming the deficiencies in the context of the project itself. And I think that's what you will see as a joint effort of the 27, as a joint effort of France and Germany. And if you want to boil it down to one sentence, I think that sentence simply is, whereas in the past, sometimes even in a blind way, we were looking for realizing a deeper union. Now it will be about a stronger union, and that there is a difference between deeper union and stronger union is already sufficiently illustrated by the fact that a stronger union could also be realized by having less union, less legal prescription in some areas, but rather subsidiarity, which leaves room for the nation states that are part of the European Union, because we won't abolish the traditional European nation state in a project of federalism. This is not what we are going to do. It will be preserved within the context of a larger union that is as strong as necessary, and strong as necessary today means stronger than today.
Let me ask you both, is Europe on the ballot in the French presidential elections and the parliamentary elections? Is this an issue that's to be debated? Is the future of Europe a ballot question for French voters as they head into these critical elections, because you have a candidate right now in Marine Le Pen who's polling well, who has a very different vision of Europe.
I would say it's always ambiguous, ambivalent. Europe in our political campaigns is an easy scapegoat because people may be frustrated with this bureaucracy, with the lack of efficiency, and our politicians may be tempted to denounce the inefficiency of Europe instead of looking at their own record, and it's a classic, if I must say so. So that's one. Second, this time the issues at stake are probably beyond the European Union itself and the project and the integration, are more focused on the situation in Europe as a whole, meaning recession, unemployment, welfare state, but also migration and security, and all these issues where the people have the feeling that our national states, but also the European Union, is not doing what it should do to improve the situation. So it's part of the debate, frequently in a rather simplistic way. On the other hand, people, I think, understands and realize the added value of the project. Now we are in France, and I think in Germany as well, in maybe a third generation of students who have done these programs of Erasmus exchanges. The single currency has been criticized, and there are critics on the governance. But if you look back, the situation of Europe after the Lehman Brothers crisis and financial crisis of 2008 would have been 2 or 3 times worse than it have been with the euro. Euro have been a protection to our economies during this period, and it's more simple for work. And in terms of foreign policy, we are a little behind, but I think we are doing progress. And all in all, as long as, like Andreas just said, we preserve our diversity, our culture, our national states, our identities, most of European citizens, including in France, I believe, are ready to continue in the framework of the European project with the condition that it delivers a little more on priorities like security, social protections, and issues like that, and not interfere in their daily business, where sometimes it's some kind of micromanagement, which is not very much appreciated. So it's part of the campaign. It's instrumentalized. It's clear that in France there is one big candidate against Europe. The others, major candidates, are more pro-Europe, but it's probably not the main angle of the campaign. The campaign is more on the issues themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andreas, and one complicating factor, I think, for both elections, but the German government has already said that they're quite concerned about potential Russian influence into your election, which adds an additional potential complication to. Elections are never easy. These are tough questions, and there looks like a race is afoot in the German elections.
Well, I think we took the necessary precautions to the extent that is possible. We just had a case recently. You will be aware that we are deploying troops now in the Baltic states and in Poland as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence. And the state in which German troops take over a lead role is Lithuania. And they were just about to deploy, and suddenly news broke that German soldiers had raped a Lithuanian girl. I mean, being honest with ourselves, we are never excluding anything. So we looked into the matter, and the Lithuanian authorities, it took us 24 hours to really find out that was totally unbased.
Just
totally
like
unbased, with the necessary traces that led us to the authors of the rumor. I would rather expect, if we don't succeed in conveying that message to our Russian counterparts, I would rather expect that kind of meddling in the elections than the highly sophisticated electronic assault on systems, because there, on the one hand, precautions are being taken now, and on the other, we were joking because we compared notes earlier. France and Germany are very old-fashioned when it comes to elections. It's done on paper with a pencil. It's not highly electronic, the whole process itself, which gives us some extra security in that regard. But it's a possibility, it's a new phenomenon, and we see Russian hands in many national contexts in Europe, and now Europe also beyond the European Union, especially in the Western Balkans. The whole story about the attempted coup in Montenegro. We have, I think today or yesterday, Dodik, president of the Republika Srpska, travels to Russia. There is, clearly felt Russian influence in Bulgaria, Romania, etc. So that's, and it's not an exclusive Russian phenomenon. There are other actors, China with the so-called 16+1 process. China reasserts its, or tries to reassert its influence with member states of the European Union. So that's not a particularly new phenomenon, but in terms of individual cases of aggressiveness, I think it is totally new. And there, we just also use our channels with Russia to clearly confront them with the realities. And I hope that they will reach the point where they understand that first, it's not successful, and second, it should not be done, because that's not the basis of the kind of relationship you want to have with them.
Russia policy certainly was quite a subject of our election. In some ways, it's a more subtle conversation. In French elections, you have Mr. Fillon and Ms. Le Pen have a much more, my words, accommodative approach to Mr. Putin, Ms. Le Pen even more so. So Russia policy could be part of that. And of course, within the German context, Chancellor Merkel has been very forceful in the sanctions regime and being linked to Minsk agreements and fulfillment of those. I think Social Democrats have a more accommodative approach. Again, my words. Does Russia policy play into this election cycle, and how will that change your approach? Nicola, you've, through the Iran talks and at the UN, you have worked with many Russian diplomats and know their approach. How does this impact that conversation?
Yeah, it's true that the relation with Russia, what's happening in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and what the press is reporting about interferences in domestic policies is part of the discussions in a campaign in France. It's true. Now, again, I would just say that this is not the issue number one in a campaign. What matters for the people is their domestic security, jobs, education, environment as well, and things like that, and Europe. So it's not parameter number one. It's one issue. Foreign policy, like here, is not always the issue on top of the list for the average citizen who goes for elections. And if you look at it, there are statements in campaigns. So Madame Le Pen, to be direct, is clearly on this side. For the other candidates, I would be more nuanced, because there is in France traditional policy to have good relation with Russia. It has been there for a long period of time. We will celebrate soon, I think, the 300th anniversary of the visit of Peter the Great to France with Louis XIV, and there is this common history, this wish to to cooperate. It's pretty difficult now, today. Everybody, I think, is recognizing that we are facing challenges in terms of resolving the crisis in the Middle East, in Syria, and in this region. The way we should resolve the crisis in Ukraine, and the way we need to engage and to resolve this. I think there is a large degree of consensus of that. And even one of the candidates you mentioned, who was against the sanctions on Russia, said recently, we need to lift the sanctions once Minsk is implemented. So some say we need to implement Minsk and then we will lift the sanctions. The others say, I want to lift the sanctions once Minsk is implemented. So all in all, it's not so different. So it's reassuring. So unless we have one particular result in the election in France, I expect a good degree of continuity in terms of policy with this issue, with our relation with Russia, always with the desire to resolve the issues, to engage Russia, to get rid of sanctions once Minsk is implemented, because this is the ultimate goal, and to find solutions in Europe, in the Middle East, together, instead of continuing on some confrontation path.
Andreas, before I turn to you, I think we're all very, very concerned. The Minsk ceasefire agreement is broken on a daily basis. We've seen an uptick in violence over the last 2 weeks. OSCE monitors have been fired upon. Does there come a point where we're pointing to an agreement it isn't working? Do you increase sanctions? It feels as if we keep pointing to something that's not working. It's at a low level. How do you, the Normandy format has been the tool that has been used to do this. We're stuck. How do you unstick ourselves from people being killed on a daily basis?
Well, we are aware of many situations in the world. I don't want to belittle this individual case, but of course, look at Syria. What do we do about the Aleppo crisis? So we are facing many situations where even with the best tools and the best effort, we don't succeed in avoiding violence. Now, in the case of Eastern Ukraine, yes, you're right, the violence is up, and also it's not just a question of the quantity, it's also a question of the quality, the things that happen on the ground, certain formations moving into the gray zone, along the line of contact, the use of heavy artillery, which is clearly up, then the exposure of the civilian population, that has also changed in terms of quality. The parties fire on vital infrastructure, which they haven't done in the past, but maybe accidentally, but not as it looks now as an expression or reflection of their policy. So things are getting worse right now. Can we turn that back? Personally, I'm optimistic that we will be successful in containing that violence. There are many factors that lead into this. And I don't want to dwell on them, but it's simply a fact that there are many new aspects that are specific for the situation now that have led to that increase in the use of military means. What is really important here is that we preserve a tool to approach the two parties, the Ukrainians and the Russians / the separatists. And you need a normative context, like you've said, ceasefire agreement. The ceasefire agreement is part of the wider Minsk agreement. So if we threw that out of the window, basically saying it doesn't work, so we throw it out of the window, it would be extremely difficult to work with the parties and to turn the wheel as it needs to be turned to reduce this violence. We've already seen that immediately after the Normandy meeting, which we had in Munich, violence was down, but then it moved up again. This is one aspect of Minsk, the question of how do you regulate, how do you influence the military status quo. And there I would say broadly Minsk has been an extremely successful tool over the past, and it will remain a necessary tool in the future. Now, it's a totally different question whether Minsk delivered the goods of a solution, a political solution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And there, I think we can only be frank. We should not lie to ourselves. We have made very little progress in spite of investing hundreds of hours into this at our level, negotiating with the parties, and what is even more important, at the level of our leaders. I mean, the French president, the German chancellor, they've also spent, probably 3-digit hours with the parties on finding a way towards a roadmap, discussing the law on local elections in Ukraine. I think I don't overestimate if I say that the chancellor and the French president, they've become experts in Ukrainian local law, simply because with the parties you can hardly negotiate these issues without looking at possible draft legislation or at draft legislation, law on special status for eastern Ukraine. The articles are individually negotiated between Putin and the French president and the chancellor. And in spite of all this investment, we have not come to the point where it looks like the Rada, for instance, was in a position to pass this legislation. And the reason for this is the old hen and the egg problem. What comes first? Will there first be sufficient security on the ground with the necessary guarantees? Or will there first be first steps into a new political reality, as the Russians would interpret this? Which is to say, for those who are not part to these negotiations, some form of autonomy in the Donbass. And there we have not been able so far to cut a deal. I would, however, caution, I don't think after all these months of negotiating with the parties that you could possibly reduce the substance in a way that would be translated into a simple deal, let's say, with 3 variables or whatever. Because some of the things you would have to offer, we don't want to offer. Future of Ukraine's NATO status, possible membership in NATO. I would not want to touch it and throw it into a basket in negotiations unless the Ukrainians suddenly feel that is something they would want to do. So some of the goods are not available for us. Some of the goods may be available, but we would not want to use it in the context of negotiations. So in general, I think a deal will be extremely, extremely difficult. And that takes you back to what you have. That takes you back to this hard work, frustrating work, I can assure you, often very frustrating work, which at the end of the day has helped us for 2 years to stabilize the situation to the extent that it is not further escalating. And I'm quite, as I've said, quite positive that with the extra effort, we will also be able to do this now after we have seen the flare-ups.
So last question, because I know we want to bring our audience into this. So I want to talk about 2 countries that have significant consequences for the migration crisis that Europe is facing, Turkey and Libya. I think it was either today or yesterday, German Foreign Minister Gabriel said that German-Turkey relations are facing one of their greatest challenges of the modern era. A very difficult relationship, one that Chancellor Merkel has taken leadership to create, on behalf of the EU, a migration deal to prevent the migration flows coming towards Europe. Help us understand Turkey and Turkey's future relationship with Europe. Nicolas, Libya in 2011, Germany and France disagreed on Libya. Germany abstained in the UN Security Council on the 2011 Right to Protect resolution.
Yeah.
France was ready to go, particularly on chemical weapons issues, to respond militarily. Now we have Libya where, please correct me if I'm wrong, France is sort of focusing with the UGA, also with General Haftar. Germany is also concerned about migration flows. Help us understand two pivotal countries to Europe. France's policy towards Libya, does it differ from Germany's? And Andreas, help us understand Germany's very complex relationship with Turkey. Who'd like to begin? I throw the last out for the most tricky. Who wants it? Maybe you want to go straight to the audience now. Do you? You want to take it on?
No, I want to make sure that I'm very brief on this because it would be
Just
enough
quote your foreign
for
minister, it
a
always
long
works.
evening. It is highly complex. It is extremely difficult. I mean, you're aware that we have a very large Turkish minority in the country, that we have many Germans now with Turkish roots. So this in itself, that kind of combination between what happens in the foreign policy field and how it impacts on the internal situation is very important. So far, I think we've managed well that kind of relationship. But take, for instance, that rumors have it that President Erdogan would like to campaign for the referendum on the 16th of April in Germany, vis-à-vis the double nationals that are important votes. It may be a close race, so there is a pull factor to do that, to address these Turkish nationals in Germany. That in itself is an extremely contentious issue in my country. I don't think that the debate has yet reached the point where you would see a rejection of that constitutional reform proposal because it's highly technical, difficult really to draw a line and to say this opens a door towards a new reality in Turkey, which is ... However, we know, because they were tasked, that the so-called Venice Commission of the Council of Europe has looked into the matter, and they will come up on the 10th of March with a report. And it very much depends on which way that report goes, how this internal debate in Germany will be influenced, and how the European debate will be influenced. I think that's very important. We've always advocated accession negotiations with Turkey. Before the coup, after the coup, yesterday, today. We advocate accession negotiations. They are very important for the future of Turkey. They are very important for the kind of relationship we have with them. But just imagine if suddenly an opinion was generated that said that this constitutional reality on which Turkish citizens will vote on the 16th of April by itself is already of a quality that Turkey cannot be an accession candidate anymore, then we have, I think, an extremely difficult debate, because it would be taken out of the hands of the experts and it would be discussed in the political domain. And I don't know which way that would suddenly go, because each and every member state in Europe, in the European Union, has its own home audience, and it will be very important how the feeling in the communities is. I think it's important to see, because given our difficult history, our dark history as Germans in the 20th century, I think we have learned, even there where we are strong, even if we are aware of our own tools to influence things, to think twice before we apply them. And sometimes also to show a kind of self-denial. And that is very important with regard, you mentioned I served in Israel as ambassador. I'm aware of the delicate relationship with Poland. So with regard to some special relationships, I think it was always important that Germany controlled its own power and sometimes even denied it. And that has created a certain culture that makes it possible for us, until today, in the case of Turkey, to sometimes say, you know, maybe another state, if he was provoked to that extent, he would push against it. But we try not to push, because what we feel is that on the other side, post-coup, there is an actor that is so very confused to a certain extent, I think, you know, and now I just don't mean the government, I mean just the collective psyche of Turkey post-coup, that it will be very difficult for such a prominent partner as Germany if we tried visibly or not visibly to push the Turks into a certain direction. And that creates a lot of, I would say, difficulties in the relationship, because Turkey right now, post-coup, is just not the actor who steps back also 2 steps, looks at it and says, oh, these guys, you know, I think what they really want is a win-win situation in our bilateral relationship. So let's conduct a policy that fits this kind of approach. This is just not happening right now. And there are so many areas that are relevant. We've just mentioned Europe. We can look at the Middle East and Syria. We can look at many, many aspects of Turkey policy. That's, among other things, what makes it so difficult. Turkey is crucially important as an actor for most of the issues we're dealing with right now. And it's extremely difficult. I think our US colleagues feel something
we struggle,
similar.
Absolutely. Turkey is such
you know,
a
you
critical
kind of
country.
struggle.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And even if there was a Turkish colleague now, I think I can emphasize that we tell them straight, you know, that this is part of the difficulty.
I couldn't agree with you more.
face.
Turkey is so critical, and these are really important issues. Nicola, just hold that Libya question. I'm going to grab a few questions from the audience. We only have a few minutes. I apologize. We could go on for a little while. There's so much to talk about. We just have to have you both back, so that's what we're going to do. But I see a hand there, a hand here, and one right there. If, Matt, we could do 3 quick questions. Please introduce yourself and go straight to that question so we can turn to our panelists for a response. Please, sir, thank you.
Sure. Hi, James Siebens from the Stimson Center.
You have to really talk loudly
Sorry.
in that microphone, sorry.
James Siebens from the Stimson Center.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to your conversations around the common security and defense policy in light of recent uncertainty maybe from the US administration and also the Ukraine crisis, et cetera.
Thank you. And if you just, the microphone, Max, right there.
Thank you. David Cadier, Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins. What do you expect from your US counterparts on Syria and in terms of finding a political solution to the conflict? Because this aspect of the Syrian conflict has, in my view, been out of the debate in the US since January, but it's a conflict that directly affects Europe in many ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Just right there, and then I'll go.
Mike Macetic, PBS. What? Oh, Mike Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. Could you please tell us with whom exactly you've met here in Washington? And second to Mr. Michaelis, did I understand you right that you said that you won't get into heavy-duty Brexit negotiations until after the German elections?
So the future of CSDP, U.S. position on Syria, the political process, maybe you could weigh in about no-fly zones if you wish, and then are you willing to tell us who you've met with? So whom you've met with. You can do that if you decide. Yeah. Nicola?
First, just a word on migration before the other issues. I agree 100% with what Andreas said. Migration is obviously a challenge and even a threat for Europe. It has been there for the last couple of years. I believe the migration factor will remain a challenge for everybody, everywhere for the decades to come because it's a new phenomenon. At the end of the day, whether it's Turkey or Libya, it's all about finding political solution to keep the people where they are and to have the people staying home. And in the case of Turkey, we need to resolve the Syrian crisis. It will help a lot. In the case of Libya, we need to find a political solution that would put in place in Libya post-crisis governance, comprehensive, inclusive governance in Libya that will be in charge of controlling the country. So, and this is all it's about. Now, the European Union is reacting. In the case of Turkey, we are negotiating with an organized state. We have this agreement we concluded a year ago in Brussels, and it started to work. We have better results in terms of cooperation and migration with Turkey since the spring of 2016. In the case of Libya, it's very difficult because there is no interlocutor. We have this government who is not very much in charge. The European Union is taking action with an operation in the Mediterranean. We are trying to organize our cooperation. I think it's a threat to Italy to have hotspots in Greece and Italy, etc., etc. So the challenge remains, but I believe we are doing progress. We need to organize. And at the end of the day, political solutions in the countries, and second, in our countries, not put everything in the same bag. You have political refugees, and it's our tradition, and we are proud of it, to welcome and to host political refugees. We cannot take all the economic refugees, and we need to find different solutions for economic refugees because it's a different category, and we will continue in Europe to work along these lines. Maybe a word on CSDP.
Please.
It has been there since 1970 in a way. We did progress after the end of the Cold War. It's a work in progress. It's done together with NATO. If you look at the two last NATO summits in Wales and in Poland, the improvement of the relation between NATO projects and European defense is obvious. Since Brexit, we relaunched an effort to do more progress on European defense. We are doing that in an incremental approach. We are looking for added value. We want Europe to be present on a whole spectrum of activities, going from military actions when needed. We need autonomic strategy for Europe until civilian relief and state building if needed. So this is about that. I think the added value of CSDP to NATO is clear because it's just about doing more collectively for security. And exactly when this new administration is asking for burden sharing, more commitment for Europeans and allies in defense, when Europe as an entity decides to do more together in connection with NATO, when the European Commission is proposing projects for financing defense and project, it goes in a good direction. So I think it's a win-win project, and we'll continue to work on this. There is a meeting in Brussels on Monday, and we hope to achieve more progress. And I must say, we have differences in Europe on this. We come from different traditions, especially my country and Germany. I'm very happy to witness that we managed to overcome this difference and to make progress, and it's good news to me.
Andreas, we'll have you have the last word.
Yeah, I can only subscribe to everything Nicolas has said as far as these questions are concerned. 100% agreement. I just don't want to be misunderstood. I did not mean that after the German elections in September we will start to negotiate the Brexit. That was not what I meant to say. I meant to say that we are going to address some of the fundamental questions concerning the future of the European Union, given that we want to strengthen it. The question of the Brexit simply will come up once we have received a letter. And once we've received a letter, there is a very orderly process, because the member states will have to agree on a mandate for these exit negotiations. And the package has only been negotiated, as you fully know, once exit has happened and negotiations on the future relationship have started and have been completed. So if you take the full load that needs to be addressed in this context, it may even be that you will certainly not have a result before September, and it may even be, if we receive the letter in March and April, the Commission has not started to sit down with UK representatives to negotiate it.
Excellent. Yep, you one last.
On Syria, in a nutshell, I think we need a political solution in Syria. We are all focused, and I think it's right because it's a priority to defeat ISIL, both in Iraq and Syria, because it's a threat to us, it's a threat to France, to Germany, to Europe, to everybody. So we need to defeat the terrorists rather sooner than later. Now, once we have defeated the terrorists, or at least reduced their aggressivity and their capacities, we would need a political solution in Syria, a political transition in Syria. In the absence of that, the result would just be continuation of violence, of terrorism in Syria. If people believe that keeping things as they are would resolve the issues, I think they are misled. I think we need a political solution, a political transition. It doesn't mean regime change. It doesn't mean changing everybody, abolishing the state of Syria, but we need a more inclusive and governance in Syria. Otherwise, the terrorist group will continue to operate. They will change their names, like they are already doing. They will operate under other brands. But the civil war will continue forever in the absence of political transition in Syria. So this is why we want this to happen. Otherwise, we will not manage to achieve our priority number one, which is terrorism.
Well, Nicolas, Andreas, thank you so much. I think this has not only been a unique visit that two very important European countries come together to talk jointly to the United States, but that you shared some time with us and we asked some questions. We're working on the answers, but please join me in thanking Nicolas and Andreas.
Thank you.
Merci.